Yeah, go for it.
All right, let me grab the link.
RotoDoc, what's going on over there?
Typing. All right. We're good to go. I just
We're
tweeted
good?
it out. Yep.
All right, so we are live here with RotoViz Live. I'm Matt Friedman, Matt F. the Oracle of Fantasy Labs and RotoViz. This is the April 23rd, 2017 NASCAR edition of the show. I'm joined by Dr. Nick Giffen on Twitter at RotoDoc. He's an editor at RotoViz, a PhD in mathematics, a two-time qualifier for the DraftKings NASCAR main event, and one of the best NASCAR DFS players in the world. You can follow him on Twitter at RotoDoc, which I already said. It's just a habit from the podcast to say that last.
Oh, yeah.
Nick, how's it going?
I am doing well. I had a lot of fun building lineups this week. I think Bristol is going to be kind of an interesting race, wild one, possibly. Obviously, with NASCAR treating the surface, there's a lot of stuff to talk about, and then, of course, the rain. So tons of stuff going on. It's going to be a good show.
Yeah, let's get started. So two big things. One, qualifying was rained out. And then secondly, it seems as if the race is going to be rained out or postponed till tomorrow. We're still uncertain right now what exactly is going to happen with the race. So just to start off the show, talk about those two things.
Yeah, so about 20 minutes ago, all the media people were tweeting that the race is postponed till tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern time. Now, NASCAR hasn't officially announced that yet. So DraftKings cannot push lineup lock back unless NASCAR makes an official announcement. So they said unless I actually grabbed the rules, unless their official NASCAR scoring provider, which is NASCAR, makes an official announcement, they can't push back lineup lock. So if NASCAR does make an official announcement before lineup lock, there's a chance DraftKings will push lineup lock until probably 1 p.m. Eastern tomorrow. If that announcement doesn't come until after lineup lock, then lineups are locked. So, of course, lineup lock is 2 p.m. Eastern time today initially, but we need NASCAR to make an official announcement that the race is postponed before lineup lock for it to have any chance of lineup lock getting pushed back. So that's kind of the first things first around lock. I know a lot of people have been asking what happens with lineup lock. The second thing is, of course, in terms of strategy, what happens then? Are we going to does anything change? And I think for me, nothing changes. I think we're going to get all 500 laps in tomorrow. Yes, there's a 40% chance of rain. It kind of fades out as the day goes on. And right around 1 o'clock, there's only about a 10%, 15% chance of rain as it stands. So from 1 o'clock all the way until they'll race until midnight if they need to get this whole thing in, because Bristol has lights. There's just no possibility to get it in today. It's 100% rain all through the day and night. So that's why they're probably going to make this announcement sooner than later. And I'm sure we'll get all 500 laps. So for me, nothing changes. The only thing that could change is how the racetrack races if the rain washes away all that rubber that was laid down from the Xfinity race, where both grooves were able to come in, both the bottom groove and the top groove. So we'll see if it becomes a one-groove racetrack or not.
Okay, so just in terms of kind of big picture strategy, you are thinking that this is a 500-lap race. It probably will take place tomorrow, not today, but other than kind of strategy of what might happen with the track, with some rain, otherwise you're thinking big picture, it's not really different than most Bristol races.
Yeah, I'm not really adjusting anything. The only thing that could be a little different is if there is a chance of later rain showers, which there is. I mean, there's definitely between 10 and 40% chance of rain at any point after 1 o'clock. if you look at the hourly forecast for Bristol. So if we get one of those 40% periods, maybe teams will see that, think maybe the race is going to end just past halfway. So, of course, it has to end after the second segment. Well, second segment ends exactly at halfway for this race. So most likely we'll still get at least 300 laps in or something, which then I still don't think it changes strategy too much. But the idea is I'm racing this like a normal Bristol race. The only thing that could change maybe is if there is that possibility of a late rain shower around lap 300 to 400, 450, whatever, before the end of the race, the intensity will ratchet up. We might see a little bit of strategy take place. Could be more randomness.
Interesting. All right, so we're obviously going to talk more about this, get to Twitter questions, all of that. First, I want to remind you that you can get a 30% discount to a special NASCAR pass through our NASCAR podcast homepage, rotoviz.com/NASCAR podcast. With that pass, you get unlimited access to all of Nick's premium NASCAR content, and your subscription supports the pod. And then if you want more NASCAR insight from RotoDoc, Nick has some courses at Roto Academy. One of them is a video course with JM to Win of Roto Grinders, and you can check that out and the other courses at rotogrinders.com/Roto Academy. Okay, Nick, before we talk about Bristol, talk about the new content at RotoViz, and then also I think at some point this live show is going to go behind the paywall, so talk about that.
Yeah, so first of all, for this live show, we talked on the Texas show, which was the last one before the Easter break, that either this show or the next show would be behind the paywall. It's going to be the next one. So this is the last show that is on YouTube for everybody to see. After that, we're going to put it on the rotoviz.com/live page, and it'll be behind the paywall. So you're going to need to be able to be a subscriber to access the show from now on. The good thing is we're 7 races of the regular season, plus the Sprint Unlimited, plus the 2 duels. So we're 10 NASCAR DFS slates into the season. So we've dropped our prices at RotoViz. We've dropped them about 20%, even though we're more than a quarter of the way through the season. So if you sign up early, don't feel frustrated about that. You're getting a per race discount still by joining us before the season started. But we did drop our prices, so that's a good incentive now to trying to kind of join us and get behind the paywall if you're watching this not part of a RotoViz subscriber. And the other thing about being a RotoViz subscriber, you get access to all of the new stuff. So we just released our ownership percentage projections. I created a machine learning model to create those. They're quite accurate. They're able to predict out of sample data, so out of sample ownership projections with an R-squared of about 0.72, so very good. That explained 72% of the variance in ownership projections with the data that I have, and we're going to continue to improve it. And then also we just released our NASCAR Sim Scores app, so that's rotoviz.com/NASCAR-Sims, SIMS, and then that app basically lets you compare current drivers to past drivers with similar statistics at Bristol or at other tracks similar to Bristol. And it turns out for most of these, the sim scores basically just give all Bristol comps because Bristol is so unique. For example, you can go into the app, you can select Casey Kane, which I think is the default, or you can select whoever. So I'll go through here and I'll pick Austin Dillon, and I set it to no DNFs. So we're going to remove all the historical races of possible comps where those drivers had a DNF, because we want to look at upside. And in this case, with Austin Dillon starting in 20th position and having some about late teens in his practice times, both with single lap and 10 lap average, you get some comps that have very similar practice times, 10 lap times, very similar starting positions. And then also these drivers had very similar stats like driver rating, track history, etc. So all those things combined at Bristol, you get a set of drivers that are very similar in the past to how Austin Dillon's performing now. And his top 5 comps are Eric Almirola 2016, Tony Stewart 2015, Casey Kane 2016, Blaney 2016, and Eric Almirola 2014. So those are the top 5, and then we get 30 comps so that we have a nice distribution. Ceiling, median, floor, and it lets you get a nice range of outcomes. So it's a really useful app. I especially like it because it lets you see what a driver's upside is for leading laps or getting fastest laps as well.
Good stuff there. All right, let's get to the questions here. So, and it's interesting. The Twitter questions start coming in earlier and earlier each show, which whatever. So, okay, first question. Does Larson running only the high line in practice, which has caused him to have slower practice times, does that concern you at all?
It does not concern me. So Larson was definitely running the high line to try to get it to come in because he prefers the high line. Obviously, if the low line is quicker, he's going to run the low line, and he's really good at Bristol. We saw him. He raced really well in the Xfinity race yesterday. So I'm not concerned about his practice times. And it's not like the practice times are terrible. They're actually still pretty good. So I'm not concerned about Kyle Larson. I think he will lead many laps in this race.
All right. How many drivers do you target to kind of mix and match in a 3 max entry GPP?
That's a good question. So at least for Bristol, I'm trying to mix and match my Dominator targets because I want one of those lineups to try to capture as many of the Dominators as possible to have a chance at winning that GPP. So I'm going to mix and match maybe 3 or 4 guys that are drivers that are Dominators. So the ones I think that obviously a lot of people have been talking about this week are Larson, Kyle Busch. There's some people on Chase Elliott. So, those 3 are definitely the top 3 on my list. We talked about on the podcasts when we did earlier this week that those 3 were kind of my top 3 names for Dominators, and they still are, especially after practice time. So I certainly think that in a 3 max, that's the way to go, is to mix and match the Dominators. If you want to have a core of place differential guys, I think that's fine. But with the random nature of Bristol, I do think it makes sense also to maybe pick like 2 drivers with place differential that'll be in your core, and then vary the other 1 or 2 drivers that you're using. So maybe like, for example, if you want to pick Danica Patrick and just throw her in all 3 of your lineups, that's fine, or maybe 2 of 3. But then your other ones mix and match. Like, so maybe you do Danica with an Eric Jones, and you do Danica with a Casey Kane, and you do Danica with a Kurt Busch for your 3 lineups. Since Eric Jones, Kurt Busch, and Casey Kane are all $100 apart from each other, and they all start in similar spots next to each other. That's a great way to differentiate while picking one driver to kind of just go all in on.
Mm-hmm. All right. How far back are you willing to go to look into track history to determine if someone is a safe play or not? And then they're giving Kurt Busch as an example.
Yeah, well, so Kurt Busch actually has a really good recent track history. He's got the 4th best or 5th best driver rating, depending on if you look back like the last 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. He's got either the 3rd, 4th, or 5th best driver rating in most of those splits, whether you include DNFs or remove them. So, I know people look at Kurt Busch's further history when he had all of those wins, and certainly he was a much more dominant Bristol driver back then. And I kind of disregard that stuff. I certainly look mostly at like the last 8 races at a given track. It depends on the track. Obviously, with Martinsville, as we talked about on the Martinsville show, short and long form track history are both important. So I include both of those in my model to try to figure out what's important. In this case, with Bristol, it's mostly just recent track history.
Mm-hmm. All right. So you mentioned 3 Dominators before. Someone is asking who you think the 4 likeliest Dominators will be.
The 4th likeliest. So we've got Larson, we've got Kyle Busch, and Chase Elliott. I think the 4th most likely one will come from one of these 3 drivers. It'll come from either Jimmy Johnson, Kevin Harvick, or possibly, and I'm not feeling great about this one, but he did win the Xfinity race, and he was really quick in final practice, and that's rookie Eric Jones.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah.
He had really nice final practice times as well. He had 6th in the single lap, and he was inside the top 5 in the 10-lap average as well.
Mm-hmm. All right. Can you talk more about how the rain is going to have an impact on the track in terms of the grips and the grooves and additional potential for randomness, stuff like that?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting race because Bristol, I guess in conjunction with NASCAR, put down like a rosin or resin or whatever it's called on the bottom line. So it's like this big black groove around the bottom of the turns, and it made it really sticky. And it actually ended up, so when you and I recorded the podcast on Friday, it was like right after or during first practice, and I couldn't quite tell which groove was going to be the best yet because I wasn't watching at the time as we were recording. And it turns out the bottom is the fastest around with that stickiness resin that they put down. Well, if that begins to wear off, then maybe the top groove will become the fastest groove again. But the top groove needs rubber to make it more get rubbered in and give it more traction as well. So if the rain washes away that rubber, maybe the bottom groove will still be the best. I do think over the course of 500 laps, if we don't have any rain delays tomorrow, for example, then I think the bottom groove will be the groove to be in at the beginning of the race. As the race goes on, I think you'll see both grooves will probably be good, and maybe by the very end of the race, the top groove will be the place to be.
Interesting. So we just have a ton of Larson questions. So someone is saying, assuming like, he's going to crush, like, he's great at steep tracks, do you go overweight or do you go underweight on him in GPPs?
Yeah, that's also a really good question, and I've struggled a bit with what I'm going to do with Larson, and I finally ended up just going with it. So my ownership projections give him just under 40% ownership projection. I think that's ballpark about right. I think between 35 and 45 sounds pretty legitimate for him. I'm going right around the top end of that range for me. I think that is a combination of the fact that he starts on the pole. He's been so good this year, not only at steep tracks, but just at every track. He's been so good. And I think, just the fact that he starts on the pole, he's a great steep track driver. He's been so good this year. I'm going to have a hard time fading him. Even with the randomness of Bristol, I'm going to have a hard time fading a guy like Kyle Larson starting on the pole at one of his, possibly his second best track. So I'm going to be basically, I think, about even with the field on him, and I'm going to find my differentiation elsewhere.
Interesting. All right. Someone's asking thoughts on Matt DiBenedetto.
This is a good question because earlier in the week, before practice and everything happened, everybody was high on Matt DiBenedetto because he finished 6th and he finished 17th last year. He also had a 21st 2 years ago. So, this is a good track for him. However, he's on a different team this year. He's on Go Fast Racing, and I guess they've shown some speed at times, certainly, especially in qualifying. But this weekend, for whatever reason, DiBenedetto has really struggled. He tweeted out that the car wasn't very good. They were still looking for their handling. I'm not as high on him as I was earlier in the week. So I do think he'll be maybe 10 to 15, possibly even up to 20% owned. My model gives him my model gives him about 19% ownership. I think he might go a little under 19 with the issues he's been having in practice, but I think 15% is possibly what we'll see from him. I'm going to be underweight on DiBenedetto.
Okay, so the next question, and by the way, this is attached on Twitter with a meteorological map of the United States, so you can see the thunderstorms here. But what time, and I don't know if you can even answer this, but what time tomorrow do you think the race is likely to start, given the rain situation we have right now?
Well, the all the media members are saying that it's going to start at 1 if NASCAR cancels the race. So it'll start at 1 Eastern. The question is, and now it looks like DraftKings has pushed back lineup locks. There must have been an official announcement while we were on the air. So they have pushed back lineup lock to it doesn't. It's not showing that for me. Somebody tweeted me that they pushed it back, but I'm still showing an hour. So I'm sure it'll get sorted out. But the idea is it'll start probably 1 o'clock Eastern time, based off of what the media members are saying. Mm-hmm. And if there's no rain, that's when it'll start. Based off of the hourly forecast, it also looks like 1 o'clock is a very good window as of right now, but we know forecasts can change. So I'm not a weatherman.
Sure. So at NASCAR.com, it just came up. The race is postponed 1 p.m. Eastern due to rain. So, yep. But it'll yet to be seen what DraftKings does with that in terms of lineup locks.
Yeah, so some people are tweeting that it has locked for them. So my next contest is now showing in 24 hours and 41 minutes. So that would be 1 o'clock Eastern. So it looks like DraftKings has pushed back lineup lock. So you guys have a whole nother day to make your entries now. Interesting.
I mean, definitely double check that for your contest. I mean, make sure that that everything.
So this is a little interesting. The contests page shows 24 hours and 40 minutes. My lineups page shows 1 hour and 40 minutes. So if somehow DraftKings ends up locking them and then showing ownership percentages, I think there's going to be a bit of an uproar in the community. So this will be pretty interesting to see what happens. We could have a lineup lock sweat.
Yeah, definitely pay attention to this. Okay, so assuming that we get all 500 laps tomorrow, How much does the postponement affect results? I mean, as you've said, basically for you, not at all.
Not at all. The only thing it affects is if maybe there's a chance of rain later in the race, then drivers will race more intensively or I don't know whatever the word is. They'll be more intense with their racing. So I think that could maybe create some more crashes. Possibly it could also create more strategy if like a caution comes out, not for rain, but for something else. Do you stay out? Do you come in? Do you try to stretch your fuel all the way to the last bit or drop, hoping you're still on the track when the rain comes so that everybody else who pitted, you go past them. So it makes it a strategy game if there's potential for rain later in the race. But we're going to get to at least halfway guaranteed, which is 250 laps. Still plenty of laps for Dominator points to matter. And I would almost bet that we get beyond 3, even 400. And I really do think we get the full 500 in. It doesn't look like the rain is going to be too dire tomorrow. And it also looks like really late in the day, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 o'clock, the rain goes away. So I think we get the full 500.
Okay, how big of a risk is a complete Truex fade? You have Truex starting third.
I don't think it's actually that big of a risk. Truex doesn't have the greatest track history here, recent or long-term track history. He hasn't had a lot of extremely strong finishes. He does have 2, I think, second-place finishes in his career, but at Bristol. But both of those were back when he was either with Michael Waltrip Racing or possibly even before that with DEI. So. His recent history hasn't been super strong, despite the fact he's been a really good team. And his practice times were okay. They weren't like fantastic. He's going to need to dominate for him to be worth it in your lineup. So it's not that risky to have a complete Truex fade. That said, I have a little bit of him. I will almost certainly be underweight on him, though. I believe. Let me check my ownership projection for him. I project him at 17.6%. I'm pretty sure I'll be underweight on him, yeah.
Okay. What is the lowest starting position you feel comfortable having your first potential Dominator starting this week? And I think the answer is probably like 2.
I think it's 2. I do have a couple contrarian lineups where I fade both Larson and Elliott, just because what if both of them, maybe after 40, 50, 60 laps wreck out or whatever? Things happen at Bristol. The R squared on my machine learning model for this one is only 0.33. So it's one of the lowest of the year. Things happen, so I definitely wanted to get some lineups in where I don't have either of them. In that case, then I'm usually going with lineups that have either... So these are where some of my Truex lineups come in, or some of my Logano lineups come in, and then Kyle Busch. I think I do have one where like Kyle Busch is my highest starter, which is in 7th starting position. So that is probably like my most furthest back that I would have a Dominator, or like my top Dominator. So I have like a Kyle Busch, and maybe it's like a Jimmy Johnson or something, 7th and 11th, 2 guys that I think can come forward and dominate that race. But that's definitely a contrarian style lineup for me. Most of my lineups will have Kyle Busch or Chase Elliott in their lineups, or I mean Kyle Larson or Chase Elliott in the lineups.
Okay, I like this next question. Do practice times get weighted differently based on the length of tracks? So, for instance, Bristol's a short track. How does that factor into your weighting of 10-lap averages versus 1-lap averages?
So the length doesn't matter as much as the tire wear matters. There is an importance, obviously if you're running 10 laps at a half-mile track, you're only running 5 miles. If you're running 10 laps at a 2-mile track, you're running 20 miles. So there's certainly a difference in the amount of distance you cover, and you get more information for 10 laps over 2 miles than you do over half a mile. So yes, the 10 lap, all things being equal, the longer distance, the 10 lap will probably come into play more importantly, but even at the short distances, the 10 lap tends to give you more information than the single lap. That said, again, at Bristol, both of those showed up as statistically significant in my model, the single and the 10 lap from final practice.
Okay, so someone here is asking about thoughts on Truex and Jimmy Johnson. You just talked about Truex, and you talked about Jimmy Johnson a little bit earlier as a potential 4th Dominator, I think.
Yeah, so I mentioned him, Harvick, Truex, a couple, Logano. I floated around some names that could be a 4th Dominator, Eric Jones, for example. And Jimmy Johnson, he's got solid practice times, both within the top 8 in single lap and 10 lap average in final practice, so that's nice to see. He starts 11th. Bristol isn't one of his best tracks, but he's certainly not horrible here by any means. So I think there's Dominator potential. If we look at the NASCAR Sims app, his upside for laps led is around 18% of the laps led. So let's round it up to 20. Then that's 100 laps led. That's going to be plenty of laps led for an upside. So, I don't think he necessarily leads 100, but if he leads 50 laps, I think you're in good shape there with Jimmy Johnson.
Okay. Someone's asking your favorite Dominator other than Kyle Busch and Kyle Larson. I think that's Chase Elliott.
Yeah, that's Chase Elliott. And I'm not playing many Kyle Larson and Chase Elliott lineups. I should say. I do have a couple of them, but most of them I'm doing either Kyle Larson or Chase Elliott. We've talked about this a few times this year where the drivers starting first and second have both dominated portions of the race. I still think it's kind of just been a clustering effect of some randomness where like it's happened 3 times or 2 or 3 times this year, but it's not more likely than it was last year to happen. I think it's just kind of, when you flip a coin, sometimes you get 10 tails in a row, but that kind of thing. So I think I'm doing most of my lineups with either Kyle Larson or Chase Elliott. I do have some with both, and I do have some with neither.
Mm-hmm. All right. Someone's asking, now that your wife is a doctor, congrats, by the way, who is she using her newfound powers on to wreck out this week?
Who's she using her newfound powers to wreck out? I guess that's a joke about how everybody I pick was wrecking out at the beginning of the year.
Yes.
I like that. Well, she's a Dale Jr. fan. She's still asleep right now. She had a long 2 weeks, obviously. But I'm sure she's going to use her powers to wreck out Dale Jr. We should talk about, actually, so before we go on to the next question, I do want to talk about some pivot plays because I found some really important ones that I want to talk about, but Dale Jr. being one of those, but I think she's going to use her powers to wreck out Dale Jr.
Okay. So, actually, I was going to say, let's talk about some of the drivers, and I think these would be some of the guys you're thinking about, but drivers who are starting further back, because there's been so much focus on dominators and potential dominators. Who are some of the drivers further back that are catching your eye?
So I think the chalkier ones that are catching my eye are Daniel Suarez starting in 23rd. He was incredibly quick in final practice. Inside the top 5 in both single and 10 lap. Then you've got so I think he's super chalk for GPPs. He's certainly cash game usable this week as well. Casey Kane, he was first and third, I think, in final practice in single and 10 lap. He was first in 10 lap and third in single lap, which is blistering. And Casey Kane also has a really good recent track history, especially like that 2012 to 2014 range. He also got a win in there, but he had a lot of top 10s, top 5s during that time period. So this is a good track for him as well. If his car is fast, he's starting back in 17th. I think he becomes a pretty chalky GPP play. And then back in the 20s, we talked about Paul Menard on the show. He's starting 26th. He's been really fast in practice. This is a very good track for him. So I think those are some of the chalkier names that we're going to be talking about in terms of the GPPs.
All right. And Kenseth was a guy that you had mentioned on the podcast. What are your thoughts on him? Has that changed any? I
think Kenseth will be chalky from an ownership percentage standpoint. He is a driver I love fading in GPPs. I think he's going to be, my model has him about 45%. That certainly is because both myself and Stevie have recommended him for cash games, and that inflates his ownership percentage. So that definitely means he'll be a relatively chalky play. I think 45% by my model might be a little high, but I think even 35%, he's still a good fade. So he wasn't fast in final practice. He was 20th, I think, in the single lap, and his 10 lap was a couple spots better than 20th, 18th maybe. I don't have it right in front of me at the moment, but I remember it being in the back half of the teens. So doesn't look super fast. This is a very good track for him, though, and he starts far back, and he is Matt Kenseth, so I think that's why a lot of people will be on him. I just think this is one of those chalky guys that we kind of want to fade, and we talk about pivot plays. I think Dale Jr. is the perfect pivot off of Matt Kenseth. Dale Jr., $8,600, so $500 cheaper, starts 2 spots higher, which is, I guess, a negative thing if you look at overall potential for plays differential, but he practiced faster than Matt Kenseth in the single lap. He was about the same in the 10 lap, but I think he's just a really interesting pivot play from an ownership percentage standpoint at a track where a lot of randomness takes place, and this is a good track for Dale Earnhardt Jr. as well.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, actually, here's a random question. So you mentioned Dale Jr., he's 20th, Kenseth is starting 22nd. I'm curious, not necessarily in terms of dominators, but in terms of finishing position. So, like, where is the sort of like the tipping point in terms of like your potential benefit of finishing high in a race? So let's say you're starting on the pole, you have a pretty good chance, like statistically, of finishing within the top 5. Like, where is the tipping point? So I'm assuming like the difference from 20th to 22nd, like that's pretty marginal. Where is the difference where it starts to matter?
What specifically starts to matter? I guess.
So let's say if you're starting 10th versus starting 15th.
Gotcha.
Like what's the difference there in terms of like your chance to finish in the top 5 or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess all things being equal, of course, you're going to want the guy who's starting 15th instead of 10th if the 5th place is your finish. I guess the tipping point is somewhere in those mid-teens if you're going to get a top 5 where you become really usable. It, of course, depends on your price point as well. I think if we're talking this mid-8 to low 9,000 range with Kenseth and Dale Jr., for example, I think if you're going around 13th, 12th, you're probably getting a little too high if you're only finishing 5th. At that point, you're going to need some dominator points as well to be worth it in that 8 to low 9K range. But, obviously with Dale and Kenseth being 20th and 22nd, certainly a top 5 finish is possible for either of these drivers, and I think they're both usable in GPPs. I just really like Dale Jr. from a leverage, kind of pivot perspective off of Kenseth. So I have the numbers in front of me now. Kenseth was 20th in single lap and 15th in 10 lap. Dale was 10th in single lap and 18th in 10 lap. So his 10 lap was slightly worse than Kenseth, but his single lap was a lot better. Both of those factor in, and overall, just based off of projected ownership percentages, Dale should be under-owned and Kenseth should be over-owned. So I'm gonna close the gap there a little bit with my ownership percentages between the two because I think that's a great pivot play. Let's talk a couple other pivot plays. I think there's some names that I really want to talk about. And so we mentioned Eric Jones' potential for dominance. Casey Kane I mentioned as a chalky name. Well, Eric Jones is 7,800, Case Kane is 7,600, and I think both of those could have pretty decent ownership, which means Kurt Busch could go a little under-owned. That said, of course, we have talked about Kurt Busch having a very strong track history, and we did mention it on the podcast earlier, but I think of the 3, he still could be the lowest owned and is a good pivot play off of both of those guys. The other thing that's interesting is all 3 start between 14th and 17th starting position. So not only are they similar in salary, similar in starting position, that means most people are choosing one or two of these guys, and usually I think it'll be Kane or Jones based off of their final practice times, where both were inside the top 6 in both single lap and 10 lap, whereas Kurt Busch wasn't. But things happen at Bristol, and that's why I like Kurt Busch as a pivot play off of these 2 drivers.
Mm-hmm. Someone's asking, why are there no rookies in the SimScore app?
Because they don't have a track history here, so I can't actually get a similarity score for them. So when we get to some of these tracks where you come back a second time, they'll be in the SimScore app. But if they don't have a track history here, that's part of figuring out what they're like. Now, I could take just their this year history, but this is also the first steep track we've been at. So I don't even have any track type history for Eric Jones or for Daniel Suarez. So it just wasn't worth it to give them comps that didn't make any sense.
Right. In the article, you talk about Kyle Busch being the fastest in 20-lap average. Where do you find a 20-lap average?
That was just mentioned on TV. He was the 20th fastest fastest in the 20-lap average. That was mentioned on the practice. If you watch, Fox Sports, I think it's FS1. I watch it on Fox Sports Go, but if you watch the practice, they mentioned it on TV.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me see here. Someone's asking when are we planning on the live show being behind the paywall? That is next week.
Yep, next week.
I think that's all the questions that we have here. I think it's kind of a light show because
the rain. I think a lot of people.
It's been pushed till tomorrow. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of people knew that was coming and probably figured they'd get their lineups either set and then see if it got pushed back. So makes a lot of sense. I will still be around on Twitter, so shoot me any questions that you have. And again, this show will be going behind the paywall next week. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I would say is just if you can verify with DraftKings or whatever before you just assume that lineups will lock tomorrow instead of today. Like the last thing you want is just a lot of dead lineups.
Exactly. So if you're still editing lineups, if you're still creating lineups, make sure you have usable lineups. Don't just put in dummy lineups right now. Don't just put in dummy lineups right now thinking that it's guaranteed that things will lock at 1, because my 2 pages are still showing different things. My contest page shows 24 hours, and my lineups page still shows 1 hour, so I'm not sure what the difference is there.
Right.
But yeah, just keep checking with DraftKings. I know they had talked about it a little bit on Twitter. I'm going to go to their Twitter handle right now and see if they've mentioned anything. It doesn't look like they've mentioned anything publicly. Let's see if they've replied to anybody with it. We haven't received. That was an old one. So yeah, we'll just we'll have to see what happens with DraftKings, and so stay tuned. It does look like if you go to the main page here, that they now say Monday at 1:00 Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific, and so entries can still be entered until then. But the lineups page, for whatever reason, is still showing 1 hour until lock. So there's a little bit of confusion there for me. But I think lineups won't actually lock until 1:00 tomorrow.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense. So Nick, I think on the podcast you had Larson as your pick to win. Is he still your pick?
He is. He's still my pick to win. I think this is one of his best tracks. I think once that high line comes in over the course of 500 laps, that'll favor him. And this might just be the year he does it with all those second places he's had this year, with that one win he's had this year, with as strong as Ganassi overall as a team has been this year. I think this is the year they get it done. One other thing I wanted to say, if you go to the main page, like the DraftKings main page, and go to the NASCAR lobby, contests look like, if had they locked at 1, there would have been a lot of overlay. So maybe that's why we're also slow in questions this week, is maybe people just aren't entering, or just assumed the race would be postponed. So, just stay on top of that. There's as of right now, a lot of spots open and a lot of contests. So, that could change by 1:00 tomorrow. But right now it looks like there's a decent amount of overlay.
That's really interesting there. All right. So you're still on Larson. Any final thoughts here?
Nope. No final thoughts. Like I said, hit me up on Twitter if you have any questions. I'll be happy to answer them. Obviously, with no race today, I won't be consumed in the race. So I will be watching the IndyCar race. They're also going to be racing in the rain. It's been raining down there in Alabama. They race on the street courses left and rights and stuff. And it looks like it's going to go from a wet race to a dry race. That'll be interesting. So if you're missing your racing craving today, check out the IndyCar race.
All right, that's going to do it for the NASCAR edition of RotoViz Live. For Nick Giffen on Twitter at RotoDoc, I'm Matt Friedman, Matt at the Oracle. Thanks for tuning in.